Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest.
We don't have a fourth branch of government called Elon Musk, and that's going to become real clear.
February 6th, 2025, the Rampaging Musk edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C., and as Elon Musk now certainly knows, my social security number is 586-32-2525. From the New York Times
you didn't just
Magazine.
read your real social security number, did you?
We'll find out. From the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School, Emily Bazelon, whose home address is, of course, according to the U.S. government, 3728 Magnolia Court, New Haven, Connecticut. John Dickerson, co-anchor of CBS Evening News from New York City. He paid exactly $3,478 into Social Security in 2024, according to Musk. This week on the Gabfest, none of those numbers are real, by the way.
Phew.
As far as I know.
Well, because David, weren't you a radical? Didn't you once hold the view that it didn't matter who had your social security number?
Oh, yeah. I published my social security number once back when I was younger. I don't think I would do it today.
Such a poor idea. Don't do that, people.
This week on the Gabfest, Elon Musk's shocking takeover of the federal government gets more and more and more and more alarming. Can anything or anyone stop him? Then, compared to the rest of the world, Americans are very rich and very unhappy. We will talk to David Leonhardt of the New York Times about some depressing new data about how miserable Americans are and why we're miserable. Then bounty hunters, death penalty mandates, scaring undocumented kids out of school, National Guard to the border. We are going to talk about the increasingly aggressive state policies in red states to assist Trump on immigration. Plus, we'll have cocktail chatter. The assault on the federal government deepens. It's no longer just worrywarts who are saying we're in a constitutional crisis. There's what Donald Trump is doing with executive orders and insane policy announcements. The annexation of Gaza now is happening, but that is not overshadowing the deeper work of the administration. At agency after department after commission, employees are being targeted for removal. Entire areas of work have been disavowed. Government data is disappearing. Probably most alarmingly, the DOGE attack on the federal government has accelerated. Access to the Treasury payment system, the dismantling of USAID, the request for the entire federal government to resign, unauthorized promises of payments to employees, all unchecked and unstopped and carried out by Musk and his 20-something or sometimes 19-something acolytes. So, Emily, I think if I were a Musk person listening to what I just said, I think I would be like, yes, there's a wildly successful and enthusiastic, and assault is a word I think they are very happy to use. What is most illegal or disturbing to you about what's happening so far?
I mean, I think the idea that we have someone who hasn't been elected or confirmed with so much sweeping power to kind of go through the federal government and access all this private data and do all kinds of things, we really just have no window into exactly what's happening. That is what I find the most alarming. It's not legal. You can't have this kind of power amassed to one unelected person because the president, outside of all of the confirmation processes, has given them this kind of sweeping mandate. And I think the lack of transparency is also both not legal and really leaves us with this sense I think you have of this assault that's taking place.
Yeah, there's these interesting things. I mean, the lack of transparency manifests in all kinds of interesting ways. One is the idea that people who are working for Musk will not use their last names and are using private email accounts and will not identify themselves on calls with other government employees. That's astonishing.
Right. As they are accessing all these systems with everyone else's private data, they don't want their identities to be known. There is a kind of brutal irony there.
It's the most sweeping reshaping of the executive branch since FDR, and in hyper speed. I've talked ad nauseum about how long it took FDR to reshape the executive branch. This is happening in super fast order, and it's following the move fast and break stuff model, which is maybe fine if you're an entrepreneur playing with somebody else's money, but the value proposition of government is entirely different than in private enterprise. And so you have this serious problem of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or given the scope of the project here, throwing the baby out with the entire bathroom. And I guess the final point would be, if you loved what Elon Musk did to Twitter, then that's what is happening here. In other words, it's not a merit-based assessment of skills related to the jobs necessary. These blanket offers of early retirement, these loyalty tests at the FBI asking which agents were involved in January 6th investigations. Turns out it's 5,000. They had to answer a questionnaire about their involvement. You have two elements that are not consistent with normal business practices and really not consistent with civil service, which is, one, indiscriminate firings. So you're not picking the best people. And that kind of matters in places like the CIA, where experience and competency are built over time. You're not picking the best people, and the ones you're keeping or the ones you're replacing them with are picked not based on merit, but based on loyalty to Trump.
Yeah. And I would note, John, I mean, I'm sure it is true in the CIA that experience matters, but it's not just true in the CIA. I mean, it is also true, I'm sure, at USAID.
Sure, I tried to pick the thing where people would die, like, immediately if they were wrong. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean,
totally.
Just like government competence matters in all kinds of ways. And of course, there are things that the U.S. government does that I don't like, or that Elon Musk doesn't like, or your neighbor doesn't like. But the fact is that duly authorized congressional legislation has said we're going to do this, and we need people to do it. And it is amazing that the dismantling, destruction of it is being carried forth without any kind of bumper, any kind of deterrence, any kind of sense of that this could be slowed or braked by anyone. It's notably the Republicans in Congress who have abandoned their responsibility to govern.
Right. I mean, we talk about this as a constitutional crisis. Usually you define a constitutional crisis as the three branches are having a kind of standoff and there's a court order and somebody is defying the court order. This time, the crisis is that the second branch of government, Congress, which has the power of the purse, which authorized U.S. aid in a statute, et cetera. That's just an example of the kinds of powers that Congress is now seeing abrogated. And Congress is totally absent. Congress is like lying down on its back with its feet up like a small scared dog. And
Republicans in Congress who are in control. And that means that there are lawsuits that are happening. And I do think in the medium term, we're still likely to see some breaks on the process and some redress of all the legal violations happening here. But it does mean that it can happen in real time in this way that would be impossible if the Republicans in Congress stood up. You mentioned, David, of course, there's plenty to, trim in the federal government, and certainly lots of different administrations of both parties have tried to do it. But, the difference, obviously, is the indiscriminate nature of it. We can all agree that losing 10 pounds might be your goal, and you would eat in a way that would affect that change. But losing 10 pounds by chopping off your leg gets you to the same result, but is not the right way to go about it. And we've seen some of the sloppiness that is totally predictable in one of the a list of CIA employees was drawn up, and it includes a huge crop of young analysts and operatives who were hired just to focus on China, information that the Chinese would really like to get. And it's now bopping around in less secure email servers and in the commerce or discussion of this DOGE operation that's going through. And one of the experts in the civil service I talked to this week said, one of the challenges of having these people rushing through the system pell-mell doing whatever they want is that they're not following any of the security protocols or many of the security protocols, which means they're leaving doors open. And there was another depressing signal from a scientist responding to the new H1N1 influenza findings in cattle, which surprised them because they didn't think it could move through species the way it did. And he's quoted in the LA Times saying, "We have to hope that Canada does the research because our federal research appears to be paralyzed by the political process." That's outside of DOGE, but it's a part of this wide sweeping retrofitting of the federal government.
I had not heard that about the China names. That's shocking. That's really. And now they'll just fire them all because these guys are compromised, so we better fire them. I don't know what to say about that. I was thinking about one thing yesterday. I would be interested in your guys' thoughts about this, which is that I think many of us believe that Trump and Musk would end up as kind of scorpions in a bottle because they are both egotistical and they're two huge personalities and they are each, acting in presidential ways. But what struck me this week was how complementary their particular skills are. Scorpion and shark, not scorpion and scorpion. Like Trump basically is after the public attention and the drama and the chaos and craves that and craves the, making headlines and having world leaders suck up to him. Musk is fundamentally an engineer who likes action and activity. And, for all that what he's doing is deplorable and like wrong, he does like getting under the hood of things and like messing around in them. And Trump is not interested in that. Trump has that was one of the reasons that his first presidency was kind of a wash, was that he actually wasn't interested in the details of governing. But these two guys, they complement each other well, and they, in a way, are force multipliers for each other. Because Trump gins up the enthusiasm in the people who are working for the administration to go do stuff, and then Musk gives them stuff to do. And then Musk gets stuff done that delights the very base that Trump likes to accolade him. So it seems like an extremely complementary relationship.
Also, is there anyone other than Musk who would have the gall to do what he's doing, to be breaking laws in this brazen way, to just go in and, ask for forgiveness later? Because people who work for the government in any
they will not ask for
capacity,
forgiveness.
Okay,
I
sorry.
guarantee you. I guarantee that's not going to happen.
Be sued later. You're right. People who work for the government in any capacity or who are lawyers with bar cards can't afford in the same way to be so cavalier about law breaking. But if you're the world's richest man and this is how you reformed other companies and you think that these are the appropriate tools, so you just like bring a bed into your the office that you've taken over in the government, like he's obviously reveling in this, right? That's what we're getting from these posts on X in the middle of the night. It's just reveling in saying and doing these things that otherwise would be totally out of bounds. The
complementary nature is that, the Trump plan is to flood the zone with, in the first, which is an expression that came from Steve Bannon in the first administration, was flood the zone with just madness. And this is actually quite focused. I mean, the plan, they were just being so much more efficient here in the second term. And Musk, all the chaos Musk is creating is exactly what Trump wants in terms of, it's a version. Musk is off doing a version of what his Gaza claim was this week. It's just like, creating chaos is a sign that the activity is good. I would add one other thing about the Senate. This week, the Senate not only is rolling over about all of this stuff, but they basically allowed the slate of the most controversial Trump nominees to go bouncing forward with. Yep. It is now okay if you are the director of national intelligence. It is now okay to believe that giving state secrets away is not treasonous. That would seem to be counterintuitive to the job. Secondly, it's okay to basically doubt the efficacy of vaccines to be head of HHS. I mean, these are bedrock, basic ideas. And you have at least two doctors in the Senate who are going to vote for this, which I wonder if the Hippocratic Oath applies to votes you take. But that's another important part of the Senate picture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what's happening at the FBI is also astounding in terms of this. They've mounted this broad search also for names of anyone who worked on any of the January 6th prosecutions. Thousands of people involved. They've fired a small number of more senior people. And it's all happening before the Senate votes to confirm Kash Patel, Trump's nominee to the FBI, who I assume will also get through despite, this clear face-off with the FBI.
A lot of the time I talk about, I should say, how nice it would be to live in a parliamentary democracy, that parliamentary democracies are effective. And what we're seeing with the Republican capitulation here is almost the creation of a parliamentary system of government without any of the good parts. You have a majority party that is acting purely as a majoritarian party, with none of the checks and balances that these separated branches of government are supposed to have. And the result is is frightening. It's dictatorship-like. And I assume it won't endure like this, but man.
Unless everything turns out to be great from doing this, which just seems, I'm not exactly being facetious, but I mean, if it turns out wonderful, then.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I do think that's the next question, which we have to keep an eye on. And you just gave two great examples, John, with the China analyst and with the H1N1 of ways in which this might quickly go awry. But what are the ways in which we're going to witness whether this is government is no longer serving its people, or government is cheaper and is serving its people with the things that they need, which is, national defense, and that's about it.
Well, it brings us back to me, in my mind, to two Michael Lewis books. I mean, one, The Fifth Risk, and the other, his book on the pandemic, which is that when the pandemic hit, there was a pandemic preparedness plan that had been worked on by Barack Obama and George W. Bush, both of whom and both of their administrations said, preparing for a pandemic is not something we're going to have to face in our own administrations, but it's part of the stewardship duty of the job to make sure there's a plan in place if a pandemic happens. When it happened, Trump had neither the people nor the will to implement the pandemic preparedness plan. And as a result, the people who look back at the failures of the COVID-19 response in the administration said he was a comorbidity. So by firing people with expertise, getting rid of people pell-mell and indiscriminately with expertise in long-range thinking about important things, you are making a big bet that nothing bad will happen that will require people who know where the glass is to break glass in case of emergency.
Two quick things to close. One, so people who are in favor of this project talk about the U.S. government, what they're doing to the U.S. government as being what they did to Twitter in a good way, or what startups are like, the move fast and break things. Why, Emily, do you think that kind of analogy is a poor analogy? What's insufficient about that?
Companies can afford to spend enormous gobs of money, take short-term risks, break things, hire lots of people, then fire them. They're not accountable in the same way. They don't have this long-term responsibility to any larger set of values or principles. They don't have to factor in medium or long-term risk-taking, right? That's just not their mission. And so it seems fundamentally different in a way that matters a great deal here. When I think about how Musk fired 80% of Twitter, I mean, there were problems with Twitter/X afterward, but it wasn't cataclysmic. It wasn't like a lot of the most dire predictions about what was going to happen didn't really pan out. The site still wobbles along. It's doing Musk's bidding, which is what I think he cared about, right? But government is just a fundamentally different enterprise. It may take a little while for us to be able to see exactly what the ramifications of these changes are, but I think to imagine that you can treat these as kind of analogous entities, which seems very much what Musk and his helpers are doing, just seems like really unlikely to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that he and Donald Trump have a different project. So, the old line, to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. Well, what if what you're doing with the eggs is egging someone's house, right? You breaking eggs to egg someone's house, not to make an omelet. And so the fundamental project in the end may not be the same one that previous administrations have been a part of. And that's why the criteria for rehiring or keeping being loyalty-based gives that away. Trump may talk about merit when it comes to air traffic controllers, but it's not merit-based. The work that he's done so far, or the instincts they've had so far. And we should also add one other thing. Imagine if all of this energy were applied towards the things like lowering the prices and other, we're going to talk to David Leonhardt about the disconnect in American society. If it was applied to any of that stuff, those are issues that are more in keeping with what we have governments for.
How do you guys think the bureaucratic warfare that Musk is waging interacts with Trump's main activities, which are these bullying power games with allies and bizarre trial balloons like his proposal, which now it seems to have been the front page of the New York Times for several days, that all Gazans leave Gaza and the U.S. somehow annex it and turn it into a resort. I mean, which is just crazy on every possible level. And the idea that it's getting any kind of attention, and I'm not trying to give it attention as an idea. I'm just interested in the kind of interaction of the bureaucratic project with this Trump being Trump in the world project.
I mean, it goes back to your great point, David, about this kind of complementary roles they're playing, where Musk is keeping the focus on all of this cutting, which in MAGA world, I assume is super popular. And then Trump gets to be on the world stage. And yeah, I mean, his Gaza proposal is just so disturbing as a historical matter in terms of thinking about Palestinians and displacement. And also has kind of, the world has to react because he is the American president, and it has to get denounced or played around with in the various ways that are happening. And so you have these two fronts in the news that are both really shiny objects for us to look at, but also have some reality to them in terms of actual consequences they're going to have. And that gets confusing. I feel like with the Musk wrecking ball to the government, it's clear that this is like a thing that is actually happening. And then the foreign policy things seem more like Trump is kind of messing around and grabbing attention.
This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Bombas. It is officially too cold to do anything, but the upside of that is you can cocoon yourself in Bombas socks, slippers, and underwear all winter long. I am addicted to my Bombas socks. When I find that I don't have a clean pair of Bombas in my drawer in the morning, I'm a little bit sad. They have this astonishing quality of being super comfortable. They're warm. They're great workout socks. They're fabulous colors, and they have a wonderful L and R on them, so I always know which is the left sock and which is the right sock. Bombas are cozy, and the secret for that is in their fabrics, like merino wool. And Bombas is super attentive to detail. They removed itchy tags. They fixed the annoying toe seam. They've perfected the fit of everything. Their slippers, for example, may end up being your favorites, but it doesn't matter what Bombas you get. For every item you purchase, Bombas will donate another item to someone facing homelessness. Plus, Bombas makes returns and exchanges easy. So try Bombas now. Head over to bombas.com/political and use code political for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/political, code political at checkout. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Found. When you're a small business owner, having your bookkeeping and taxes in order comes at a cost. It's not only about your money, it's also about your time, hours and hours and hours that you could have spent actually growing your business. But guess what? It doesn't have to be that way thanks to Found. Found is a banking platform that doesn't just consolidate your financial ecosystem. It automates manual activities like expense tracking and finding tax write-offs. And it makes staying on top of invoices and payments so easy. Small businesses are loving Found. This Found user said, Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profits, taxes, invoices even. And Found has 30,000 five-star reviews just like this. Don't put this one off. Join thousands of small business owners who have streamlined their finances with Found. Open a Found account for free at found.com/Gabfest. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC.
This election cycle has already been quite a ride. Scared? Nauseous? Wishing this thing had seatbelts? Pod Save America is here to help. I'm John Lovett, and each week, me and my co-hosts, John Favreau, Tommy Vitor, and Dan Pfeiffer break down the political news that makes you laugh, cry, and scream into the void to help you figure out what matters and what each of us can do about it. Pod Save America, the context you need for next week's news, when you won't be burdened by what has been. Listen and subscribe to Pod Save America on your favorite podcast platform now.
Okay, I am taking over the show because John and David, for various urgent reasons, have had to drop off. Never fear, we are joined by David Leonhardt of the New York Times. Hey, David, welcome.
Hello, Emily. Thank you for having me back.
Sure. We are here to talk about your really interesting new piece. It is about a report card on American well-being. And just to set the stage for a moment, there is this bipartisan, politically diverse group of scholars who have served lots of different presidential administrations, and they decided to collectively design a report card on how America is doing and feeling economically and by many other measures. So my understanding for your piece is that these scholars debated for months about which metrics best captured the state of the nation. Then they picked 37 different yardsticks about economic performance, physical health, mental health, social trust, and more. And then they tracked these measures since the 1990s to compare the United States with dozens of other countries. And what the group found is kind of central finding is twofold. On one hand, the American economy has outperformed most of its rivals in terms of productive might and innovation. But this success has not led to rapidly rising living standards for most Americans. And you have this kind of crazy quote from Bradley Berzer, who's an historian at Hillsdale College, which is a Christian school. He says, "We're so wealthy, but so unhappy. It seems like the central question of modernity." Okay, so David, walk me through what is going on here. Can you talk a little bit about what the high points of the report are for positive economic findings versus the kind of negatives that seem to be actually swamping those economic results?
Yeah, and the first thing I should say is that an economist at Tulane named Doug Harris led this effort. And he told me, look, I wasn't even sure that we would be able to agree on what metrics matter. But ultimately they did. They agreed on a set of metrics, several dozen, as you noted, that they think are important measures of how we're doing as Americans. And so the first key thing is, in terms of our overall economy, we're doing really well. And we shouldn't take that for granted. We're doing much better than Japan, much better than Europe. When you look at a chart that compares American GDP to Europe's or Japan's or really any other wealthy nation, you see us pulling away from them over the last few decades. And I'm guessing some of your listeners have seen this talked about. The Economist magazine has been particularly aggressive about highlighting this gap. And so the American economy in some basic ways is just performing better.
Right. So that seems like it should be really good news, and yet it doesn't translate into these deeper measures of well-being. So tell us a little bit about that part of the equation.
Yeah, and so that is it's the real conundrum here. And so I think when you often see people celebrating our really good economic performance and our GDP, implicit is the idea is that life in the United States is better than in these other countries and getting better more rapidly. And that's just not the case when you look at most things that people care about. So life expectancy to me is the most obvious, broadest measure. And, in the 1980s, the United States had a relatively normal life expectancy for a rich country. Today, we have the single lowest life expectancy of any rich country. It's not even that close. You look at depression. You look at some measures of social trust. You look at all kinds of things, obviously murder rate, gun violence, opioid abuse. And you go through all these things, and basically, not only have we not pulled away from other countries, but often we're below average for a rich country, and the situation is getting worse. And there are a bunch of potential explanations. The researchers who, as you noted, are from really different political backgrounds, didn't necessarily agree on what the explanations are. But I really do think, as Bradley Berzer said, I think it's a really central question for our age. Why is it that we're so rich and getting richer overall? And yet, not only are we not happy, but in some objective ways, we're just not doing that well.
Yeah. So I looked at this finding, and of course, I was very tempted to slot it into my own worldview, as one does. And I immediately thought, okay, well, GDP may be way up, but are these benefits really widely shared? Is the problem here that a small number of very rich people are taking most of the pie? And so this apparent prosperity just doesn't really translate. Your article wisely includes several explanations, not just the one I would prefer, but I want to start with mine because it was one of the ideas I think that some of the scholars offered, and I wonder what you make of their rendition of it and how plausible you think this explanation is.
I mean, I think it's highly plausible, as you do. I think it's important to separate, to say, look, this is a major explanation. It might even be the leading explanation, but it is not the only explanation. So we'll come to some of the others in a minute. But I really do think it's a major explanation. I mean, I wrote a whole book on it. You all had me on the show to talk about it. A history of the American economy. over the last century. And why is it that our economy has become more unequal over that time, and living standards have stagnated for so many people? So yes, absolutely. It is really important to say that GDP is an aggregate measure. And when inequality is rising, GDP doesn't necessarily capture the experience of most Americans. And so when you look at the incomes and the wealth of most Americans, particularly the 60+% of Americans who do not have a four-year college degree, the trends are much, much less positive economically. And I think that's just a big part of what's going on in all kinds of ways. It's a big part economically. We also have less good safety net, and so there are many more people in this country who don't have health insurance. And so there are concrete ways in which it matters. And then there are also, I think, ways it matters in terms of how people feel, because when you see some segment of Americans thriving and pulling away from others, that leads to not only economic struggles, but it leads to anger and frustration. So I think inequality is a major explanation. I don't think it can be the only explanation, because even when you look at things like working class incomes in the United States and compare it to other countries, even if the trends aren't as positive for our economy, working class people in this country still make more money than working class people in a lot of other countries, just straight out money. And so I don't think that can be the only explanation.
Yeah, just to press on this one a little bit more, I mean, I hear you about all of that. I always am struck by the gap between the amount of money people make and then their perception based on what they see from other people around them. In other words, if you think other people are super wealthy, then your ideas of what the good life is become out of reach. And it's harder, I think, sometimes to just feel content because you're not measuring yourself against the working class person in, I don't know, France or Brazil. You're measuring yourself against the rich people who are in the United States who you see around you or on your television or your streaming device.
Yes, and there are some real ways in which, in addition to psychology and social trust, it tangibly affects your life. I mean, school districts are the best example, right? If you live in a society where a lot of the rich people have gotten even richer, it becomes harder to afford a home in the most desirable school districts because the rich people bid up the prices for those schools. It's what I think Richard Reeves has described as opportunity hoarding. And so in addition to the kind of notion that other people are pulling away from you, there are real ways in which it is better to be a middle or lower income person in a society with lower inequality than it is to be a middle or low income person with the same income in a society with higher inequality.
Let's talk about another of the explanations here, which I think revolves around the idea of social isolation. What were the experts saying their concerns are in this domain?
If people haven't yet read Derek Thompson's Atlantic cover story on what a lonely time it is in America, I really recommend it. I thought of that story while I was writing this. There are just all kinds of ways in which we are more alone than we used to be. People are more likely to get takeout than in the past and less likely to go into a restaurant. They're obviously less likely to belong to a church where they socialize with people. They're less likely to belong to a labor union. They're famously less likely to belong to a bowling league. People spend hours every day looking at their phones. I mean, just think about all the little settings where you either had to sit there quietly or maybe talk to the person next to you in the past, and now everyone's just staring down into their phones. And so in all kinds of ways, we are just more alone. And human beings, moment to moment, day to day, will often choose to be alone rather than to socialize when given the chance. But it's not good for us. It ultimately makes us less happy. It makes us less healthy. And we've really had our society move in that direction toward isolation and loneliness for a whole set of reasons, including technology over the last several decades.
How about abundance and affluence itself? What are the ways in which that actually throws off negative effects?
So this is an idea that several of the experts pointed to. A couple of the conservatives in particular, although not just the conservatives, pointed to it, which is if you think about some of our problems, some of our problems are actually problems of affluence rather than problems despite affluence. So in the past, people struggled to get enough food to eat. Now our big problem is obesity and diabetes. That's a problem of society having so much that it gorges. Technology, in some ways, is a problem of affluence. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that these massively powerful computers that people carry around in their pockets are mass items. That's really a sign of affluence. It also contributes to loneliness. You think about vehicles, for example. The fact that so many people can own vehicles is a sign of affluence. It's also a source of a major public health problem in this country. I think there's then this kind of slightly different thing that's worth thinking about, and I haven't totally figured out the language around this, but the United States seems to be uniquely bad at translating our economic performance into quality of life. And so whether it's the fact that it's not just that more people die in vehicle accidents in the United States than other countries. That's long been the case because we're Americans. We drive more. We have all this, big open country and we're individualistic. It's that we've done a much worse job of reducing traffic deaths than people have in other countries. Guns are obviously another example. Opioids became an example. COVID was an example of a way in which we did worse than a lot of other countries. And so I don't think there's a tidy explanation for why that is. But there are all these features of modern life that just cause more health problems and ultimately more mortality in the United States than they do in other countries. And it's not totally clear why, but it's a terrible problem.
Yeah, there's a kind of fatalism about this that is very frustrating, I think. Last explanation, which I did not find plausible, I will say, was bad luck. This came from someone at the American Enterprise Institute who was just saying, like, a lot of once in a century bad things have happened lately, and somehow that affects Americans' perceptions in a way that's different from other countries.
Yeah, so that's Mike Strain, with whom I'm friendly, and I've actually done a series of debates online and at different colleges around the country on a version of this question. So it was fun for me that he showed up on it. We've both written books about the American dream, and so several colleges have had us there to debate it. And Mike basically argues that when you combine COVID and the financial crisis and a couple of other one-off things, that really things are better than Americans understand that they are. And he essentially predicts that over coming years, Americans are likely to become more optimistic in ways that fundamentally reflects the underlying reality. I mean, I disagree for two reasons. It's a little unfair for me to argue with Mike without having him here to argue back. But I disagree with him because when you look at all these other measures like life expectancy and all the things we've been talking about, I don't actually think the underlying reality is that great in this country when you compare it to other countries. Sure, it's much better than 100 years ago or even several decades ago in many ways, but relative to other countries, we're just doing worse on many of the measures that really define what a good, healthy life is. And the second thing is, this run of so-called bad luck we've had is not just bad luck. I mean, the financial crisis wasn't just a roll of the dice. It was connected to the problems in our economy. And the fact that we handled COVID so badly wasn't just a roll of the dice. And there's a certain point at which if we're saying, well, we've just been hit by a series of unusual things, like 9/11 and the tech meltdown and the Iraq war and the financial crisis and COVID, somehow it starts to seem a little bit less like bad luck and a little bit more like that famous line, Mrs. Lincoln, other than that, how was the play?
Agreed. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about are the political implications of these findings. In one sense, one could conclude from this report that economic prosperity is not as important to everyone's actual sense of well-being as the recent election might suggest. I mean, we heard tons about inflation and how people's grievances toward the Biden administration's economic record drove some voters toward Trump. And so first I was reading this and thinking like, okay, well, maybe people are somewhat misled about how much these economic prosperity measures actually matter to their lives. And then I thought, well, no, wait a second. They're actually responding to something very real. I may or may not agree with their explanations, but actually the problem is that this economic prosperity is not widely shared and is overwhelmed by all the problems you've been discussing. And I just wonder what you think about the political implications here.
So I think it's probably a yes and. I mean, inflation was a really big deal in this election, and it was real, and it cut into some of the mostly good economic trends over the last several years for the overall U.S. economy. It also hit poorer and middle-class people harder, the same way all the economic trends of the last several decades have. So, look, inflation played a big role, and so did, I think, the general chaos of the Biden years, starting with immigration. But when you zoom out and take a longer view, I agree with you. I think that it's important to think through in a holistic way why so many Americans are frustrated and angry. And it's not about mostly misinformation, which is an excuse people sometimes run to. And it's not that people don't actually understand what's going on. I think when you look at the things that really, I would argue, matter most to people, how long they live, how healthy they are, how happy they are, how many friends they have, how much they interact with people, the trends in this country have been really quite dark recently, and they've been particularly dark for working class people. And those are also the people who have most shifted toward Donald Trump's Republican Party. And I think you can really disagree with what Donald Trump is doing as president and nonetheless have an empathy for the level of frustration that so many people have about what's going on, and not, as the Democratic Party has too often tried to do, tell them they're wrong to be frustrated, and that if only they understood how good things really were, they would be much happier. I think voters are right to think that this country is off in the wrong direction, and that we need to think about ways to address those problems.
Right. The difference between recognizing that the concerns and the problems are real versus this question of what the solution should be.
And having some humility about the solution part too. I mean, if we're going to talk about politics, right? I mean, I think, immigration is such a big issue now. It's something that I've thought a lot about. And, for years, Democrats have lectured working class people that very high levels of immigration are actually really good for them, if only they understood that. I don't think that's necessarily true. And so it's not only recognizing the problems, but being open to the idea that the things that honestly elite members of both parties have been pushing for a long time, free trade, high levels of immigration, may not actually have been good for struggling Americans. And maybe it's worth doing a little bit of revisiting, not only of the communication strategy, but the actual underlying policies that have coincided with a really difficult few decades for a lot of people.
David Leonhardt, this piece that you've written this week is called "The U.S. Economy is Racing Ahead. Almost Everything Else is Falling Behind." Everyone should go read it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, this is Dahlia Lithwick. I host Amicus, Slate's legal podcast, and I wanted to flag our recent episode, Trump's American Takeover.
Americans have this idea that when democracy fails, it's going to fail with tanks in the streets.
Listeners are saying that Professor Kim Lane Shepley gave the single best explanation they have yet heard of how autocracy uses the law to establish itself and what we can do about it. Another listener writes, I think I needed some contextual grounding amidst the maelstrom. Dahlia Lithwick's Amicus podcast was immensely grounding. Not like I have a lot of experience with my government becoming an autocratic hellscape. You and me both, sister, you and me both.
Everything that this administration does now that is bringing down democracy and causing pain should be met with friction. You may not be able to stop it, but you can slow it down.
Listen to Amicus with me, Dahlia Lithwick. Search Amicus wherever you get your podcasts.
We've all heard a lot about what the Trump administration is doing to increase immigration enforcement and deter migration, military flights sending migrants back to India and other places, turning Guantanamo into detention camp, the quotas now for ICE, the turning away of more people at the border, et cetera. They also have willing partners in some red states where there is a zealous enthusiasm to bring stricter immigration policies to the local level and to the state level, and to be extremely delighted partners with what the Trump administration is doing in Florida, Missouri, Texas, Iowa, Tennessee, Mississippi. There are all kinds of action taking place at the legislative and bureaucratic level to increase punishment, detention, deportation, and misery for people who are here in some kind of undocumented way. So in Mississippi and Missouri, there's laws being proposed for bounty hunters to get payments to track down unauthorized migrants, tip lines where you can report people so that the bounty hunters can go get them. In Florida, mandatory death penalty for any unauthorized person who commits a capital crime. Proposals in states to force parents to state their immigration status if they're trying to register a child for school, which is a way to prevent people from registering their children for school. Texas has now basically deputized all its National Guard to assist with deportations and to conduct deportations and arrests. And it's just like a lot of stuff happening at the state level. I want to start with you, Emily. Just broadly speaking, there's been this tension about whether states have any immigration authority, whether they can do things that are assisting or deterring what the federal government is doing on immigration, or be more aggressive on immigration than the federal government. With a lot of these proposals, do you think they are going to pass legal muster?
Well, if you look at the existing Supreme Court precedent, the answer would be no. Some of these laws, like the Show Your Papers law in Arizona, were struck down, certainly protecting the rights of immigrant children to go to school from exactly the kinds of incursions you were talking about. That's protected by a decision, really important one from the 1970s. I think some of the states think, like, let's throw up some test cases for this Supreme Court. It's much more conservative. Maybe we'll see them backtrack on some of those rulings. And then they're trying some new tricks like the bounty hunters, which seems really dangerous and cruel. But I don't think we've seen that one tested before. And so, part of it is like you throw new facts into the mix and see what ends up landing. I will say that the last time we saw a round of this, which was around like 2009 to 2011, the state that went the furthest was Alabama. And it was a mess for Alabama's economy. There were all kinds of people complaining that no one was picking the crops in the fields. There was a divestment of especially foreign money from Alabama. It was just really not good for the state's economy, and there are studies of that. And the state ended up backtracking. So I wonder if we will see the same kind of buyer's remorse this time around from some of these states.
Yeah, there's a lot of business that goes on in these states that relies on migrant labor in either in construction or agriculture. And I've been actually a little surprised that in reading about this, there hasn't been more of a pushback from, that's where you used to get the pushback in the past.
Local business.
It was from the local businesses who need this kind of labor, and the people in the nice houses in the gated communities who need the services that are often provided by migrant labor.
Well, I think they're probably afraid to push back, as everyone's afraid of everything right now. The bounty hunter one is so interesting. So the idea would be that bounty hunters or bail enforcement agents, as they would be authorized to go fetch and detain people who are not allowed to be in the country, and they would get paid $1,000 for it. No one apparently consulted with any bounty hunters.
I love that part of that article.
Because the bounty hunters are like, we do not want to do this. I had not realized this, that like basically the bounty hunting business is a contractual relationship between the bounty hunter and the person who is out on bail, who has jumped bail. Like when they posted bail, they made an agreement with the bail bondsman. They agreed, like, okay, if I don't pay, if I don't show up, you can come get me. That is a contractual relationship that gives the bounty hunter all kinds of legal latitude. A situation where it's just this random person who you're detaining, and what if you arrest the wrong person? What if you get the wrong person there? Your legal defenses are likely to be much weaker, and the possibility of going awry is much higher. And I like the bounty hunter, that at least that was interviewed in the article I read, wanted nothing to do with this.
Well, that's a real bounty. I mean, when I've talked to bounty hunters, they tend to be people who, like, they look tough. Like, they often carry a weapon. They have like a huge set of keys. Like, they're meant to appear menacing, but they do not actually want to go leave their desks and go out and chase people around. Like, who needs that? That's not the part of the job that actually pays and is secure. And so I do think that bounty hunters who work under contract are not going to be interested in this. However, that does not mean that some super anti-immigrant vigilantes are not going to try to take advantage of these laws.
I love that you cited a huge set of keys as one of their menacing characteristics. They might just be the super at the big building down the block.
The super with the gun. I really have that memory of this one guy I'm thinking of.
A lot of this legislating is, two things struck me. Nobody's thinking this thing through. A lot of it's performative, and that is belied also by, or I should say, that is supported also by the fact that a lot of this legislation, at least in two states that I can think of, Tennessee and Florida, is named Trump for one, in
Tennessee reduction of unlawful migrant placement.
There you go. Exactly. Which, as we've talked about before, when we've tried to assess the role Donald Trump will have as a single unit or as a changer of American politics, everybody wants to be in the glow of anything Donald Trump in the on the rightward side of American politics. And this seems to be a part of that trend.
My prediction is the following. So there's going to be a set of these laws or policy changes that are going to be fine, or going to be that the Supreme Court's going to be fine with. I think the Supreme Court will allow Montana to say that every traffic stop can have an immigration check. They're going to allow South Dakota and Iowa to put marks on driver's license that indicate a person is a citizen. They're going to allow Texas, where ICE has now basically deputized every Texas National Guard agent to conduct arrests. They have to be supervised by ICE, which means that ICE can just call them on the phone and say, hey, can I deport this person? And ICE will be like, yeah, go ahead, deport this person. So now there's this whole army of state officials who can act as federal agents. I think the Supreme Court is going to be all fine and dandy with that. I do not think that even the Supreme Court, though, will go as far as the states that are trying to keep kids out of school or will. I don't think they're going to let them do that, because I think a policy which allows the state to basically say to anyone who shows up to register a kid, "Are you, show us your papers," is a policy which effectively is barring kids from education, because parents cannot register, they cannot show up and register kids, knowing that the government of that state now has explicit information that they're in an undocumented way, and they will not risk, thousands of kids will not be educated. And that's something that, even in a society which wants to make life difficult for people who are not here in a documented way, I think that's a bridge too far. I think the Supreme Court will not allow that piece of it. That's my prognostication, but I welcome Emily's dispute.
I mean, I really hope you're right. The Supreme Court precedent at issue here is called Plyler versus Doe. It has everything in it that you just said. It also effectively says that there is something like a constitutional right to education for everybody. Now, of course, there is the word education is not in the Bill of Rights. It's not something that we usually think of as a federal right in that way. And so that's what creates the vulnerability here. In Plyler, when people were fighting over this, and then in the dissent, the argument against your position is everything you said is true, but those are policy questions. Those are things you can work out in the democratic process. Like, of course, I, arch conservative justice, think that every immigrant child should be educated, but it is not up to me to impose that view upon the state legislature. So that's the rub here. And I still hope you're right.
Well, no, now I think I'm wrong.
What is Emily, when we talk about any of these issues, whether it's education or who has the power to enforce immigration laws, whether it's the local authorities or whether it has to be sanctified by a federal authority, what is the underlying premise? Is it federalism? Is it legislation that they're arrogating authority to themselves that wasn't granted to them in legislation? What's the sort of bedrock principle that's often at stake with these state efforts to enforce immigration laws?
So 2 answers to your question. dependent on the context. In the context of school, Plyler versus Doe, this important Supreme Court case rests on the 14th Amendment, the idea of equal protection under the laws, right? But a lot of these questions of what kind of state enforcement powers, like can you deputize state cops and state sheriff's offices to go snatch up immigrants, that has to do with the supremacy clause, the idea that it is Congress and the sovereign federal government that decides what our rules on immigration are going to be, that it's part of the federal powers of navigating the international sphere, right? Like you're talking about our sovereign nation's relationship to other sovereign nations. And so states in our federalist system cannot play that role. That has been a kind of bedrock principle of immigration law. And then, of course, like there are questions about around the edges of those rules. And that's, I think, why David's answers to what could happen with like the Texas National Guard or the Texas Border Patrol, whatever it's called, could be plausible answers, because you could see this Supreme Court saying, well, but as long as you're working with the federal officials, that's good enough.
Right.
Exactly. And then, so just to remind people, right, that it's just on equal protection, the 14th Amendment, it's every person, right, in jurisdiction, not every citizen.
It is every person, yes. However, like this Supreme Court could then still pull back on this education right.
Because education is not one of the enumerated rights.
Right.
But Emily, on the supremacy clause, the tension has been in the past few years has been Republican-run states want to do things that are more aggressive than the United States government has wanted to do on immigration, not really be partners, be in fact in opposition to what the U.S. government. But in these cases, the U.S. government welcomes this cooperation and is more or less asking for it. So doesn't that put it in a totally different, these kind of actions in a different light than when Texas wants to deport people under certain sets of circumstances, but the U.S. government does not want those people deported or does not think that applies. If the U.S. government is now saying, yes, we want your help, please do it. Here's an ICE agent on the phone for you to talk to. That seems to give it the color of the supremacy protection.
Right. I mean, you could still have an argument that the states are going too far, but I think you're right. It's a weaker argument when the federal administration and the state administrations are in sync. We're going to have a separate set of fights about some of the blue states, right, where they're going to argue you may not commandeer our state and local legal resources for your project. And there is good Supreme Court precedent to support the blue state's position. There's this case called Prince versus United States, I think from the 1990s. And that was at the time a Scalia majority. It was conservatives who were saying, wait, we don't want the federal government to be able to tell state and local sheriff's offices and cops what they can do. But now you're seeing an opposite dynamic, and it's really just driven by the political preferences.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. When you get to this end of this long week, we saw each other. The three of us saw each other at the end of the long week last week. So lovely. And immediately, I would say, all of us were cocktailed to the max.
Some even really more than others.
Some perhaps were overserved.
Not in present company excluded, by the way.
Yes. But there was a lot of great chattering there. Emily, if we were getting together again, what would you chatter to us about?
I had a lovely conversation this week for our next Gabfest Reads segment with Rich Benjamin, who has this really interesting book coming out about his family. His grandfather, Daniel Fignole, was the brief and shining kind of pro-labor leader of Haiti in 1957, who then got exited from his role in a coup and spirited out of the country by the Eisenhower administration. Anyway, I had a great time talking to Rich about his book, which is called Talk to Me. And then I also wanted to recommend a book that just showed up at my house. It's coming out in March. It looks it's so up my alley. It's by David Enrich. It's called Murder the Truth. And it's about this, secretive campaign to basically destroy American libel law. By diminishing First Amendment protections for the press, by attacking New York Times versus Sullivan, which is our fundamental press freedom precedent. And I am, of course, completely up my alley, and I'm excited to read it. So this is a preview for a book coming out in March, Murder the Truth by David Enrich.
John Dickerson, what's your chatter?
My chatter is about, we all remember probably the Great Resignation, which was the theory that during the pandemic, well, it was not just a theory. People during the pandemic in 2021, 47 million people quit their jobs. In 2022, 50.5 million people quit their jobs. This was the peak of quitting from jobs, and it was a variety of things. Wages were not keeping up with prices, but also there was a feeling, and lots of interviews back this up, and studies as well, that people felt like in the shadow of the pandemic, your search for meaning in your job was more important. And so people were saying, screw it, I'm leaving. Plus, I think the fact that there were some federal subsidies during the pandemic maybe gave people some freedom to do that. Well, the Great Resignation now has been replaced by something called the Great Stay, which is a testament really to the fact that headline writers need to declare big sweeping movements of things. However, there is actual data, and those data were released by the Labor Department this week, which showed that Americans quit 39.6 million jobs in 2024. So that's down 11% from the year before and down 22% from the peak in 2022. So the question then is, we've had the Great Resignation and the Great Stay. Where do what's next? And is what's next a period where you have people who still have all the feelings that they had during the Great Resignation, which is that they want more meaning, they want more attention to mental health in the places where they work, they want a greater quality of life with their work, but because of economic conditions, even though unemployment is still low, there aren't as many jobs as there have been available for those seeking. So are we more frustrated in our jobs than we were? Or is this a pause and there will be another great set of resignations because that's now the kind of ebb we're in? I don't know. But those were all things that I was thinking as the Labor Department was releasing those figures for 2024 this week.
My chatter was about a strange and very gratifying, egotistically gratifying experience I had this week. So I've already told you guys about it.
This is great.
Oh, wait, yes. Oh, my God. I can't wait to hear this.
So when I left, so I used to run a company, as many Gabfest listeners know, called Atlas Obscura, which is a wonderful company all about the wonders, the hidden wonders of the world. And when I left as CEO, the founders of that company, Josh Foer and Dylan Thuras, gave me an incredible gift, a gift that I have never been able to take advantage of. The gift is they bought an acre of land in the Arizona desert. They looked to try to find the cheapest acre of land in the U.S. they could find. And they found a really cheap acre of land in the Arizona desert, in eastern Arizona, near Holbrook, Arizona. And they renamed it after me. They called it the Plotz Plot. And they placed on it they placed a shed on it at first. But then when that shed blew away, they placed an orange shipping container which says in beautiful signage, the Plotz Plot on it, with a door and a lock in that shipping container. And they invited anyone who wanted to come and leave something there. And they said, it's a place for transitions. It's a place when you are going through a transition, is a way you can take a physical object, leave it maybe with a description of what that object is, and move on to the next thing. And they had asked me to inaugurate it. I didn't know what they'd asked me totally separately. They're like, can you give us something that signifies your transition from Atlas Obscura? And I had this backpack that I used to take because I was commuting from DC to New York. And it was like this backpack I would take every week from DC to New York. And since I was no longer going to be commuting, I gave them my backpack. I'm sure I've talked about this in a cocktail chatter before. And so I gave them my backpack with a note about how it signified this transition. And also at the time I was going through a marital collapse. Like there's a lot of transition going on that was very meaningful to me, the whole thing. And I gave them this backpack. They created this Plotz Plot. They put the Plotz Plot in Atlas Obscura, so you can look up, and it's a place in Atlas Obscura as a place you can visit. And if you drive down this dirt road off of Route 66, you can get to it and leave something. And the place has become, to my incredible surprise, like a shrine. So hundreds of people have been there and left objects, and other people visit just to see it. And there was a moment this week, which a number of people pointed out to me, which involved a TV show called Sister Wives, which is a very popular reality show about some people in a polygamous sect that's an offshoot of the LDS Church. And one of the wives, the ex-wives in the family named Janelle, is making a new start in her life, and she's moving from Arizona to North Carolina. And as she's moving, she decides to stop on the way, and she stops at the Plotz plot, which she must have heard about, probably from a producer, and leaves a necklace or a piece of jewelry that her ex-husband had given her, and with a note about it. And it's really beautiful. Like, the scene is genuinely touching and moving. It clearly, like, the physical act of leaving this object behind her meant something to her, and her seeing all the other objects that people had left in this shipping container / museum / shrine was meaningful to her. And it was beautiful. I was so moved by it. I've not been able to get out there to see it myself. I really want to go, but I haven't had the chance to take that trip. Now I definitely want to take that trip. And I hope other people, if you're near Kingman, Arizona, drive out of the way for 10 minutes and check it out.
Is there not a curator, but someone who makes sure that the notes that are left don't, get harmed by time and age?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think Josh and Dylan have sort of counted on the goodness of the community, that this is a place that is basically it's hard to get to, and it has emotional resonance for people. They're only going to seek it out if it has emotional resonance. And so they're counting on there not being sabotage or vandalism. I don't know why in this world. I suppose there'd be sabotage and vandalism, but I think it's an unprotectable place. Like, you can't hire someone to guard it.
No, yeah.
So,
well, you could, but you're not going to.
Yeah.
How do you get the key?
There's just a code. It's on the Atlas Obscura website. It's just like it's a 4-digit lock. I don't know what the code is. I think it is on the Atlas Obscura website. You go look on the Atlas Obscura website and find it.
I mean, it didn't look like there had been any sabotage, and it was quite moving watching the scene from the show, how many people had left objects, and it seems like it's being used exactly for what its purpose was, and really people were infusing it with a lot of meaning for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I want to give all credit to Josh and Dylan, who I worked with at Atlas Obscura, who are two people who just have like a really magical sense of how to turn place into meaning. I mean, I'm honored that they named it after me. I'm honored that like our relationship was meant enough to them, and my work at Atlas Obscura meant enough to them that they named it after me. But mostly I think it's a tribute to like their sense that physical place, you can imbue a physical place with meaning by kind of ascribing meaning to it and asking people to take part in it, in the community of it. All right, listeners, you have got chatters. You keep sending them to us. Thank goodness, at gabfest@slate.com. Really appreciate them. Our new researcher, Emily Ditto, has been going through them and annotating them and identifying good ones for us to talk about. And the one that I love this week was from Kai Wilson.
Hello, Kai Wilson here from Newton, Mass. My cocktail chatter is about The Secret Lives of Color, a fascinating book by Cassia St. Clair that explores the histories of 75 colors. Take mauve, for example. In 1856, 19-year-old chemist William Henry Perkin attempted to synthesize quinine from coal tar to treat malaria. Instead, he accidentally created a purple color-fast liquid, revolutionizing the dye industry. After Empress Eugenie and Queen Victoria appeared decked out in mauve, the color became so fashionable that Punch magazine declared London in the grip of the mauve measles. When the color eventually went out of favor, it became associated with a certain type of older woman. Never trust a woman who wears mauve, said Oscar Wilde. It always means they have a history. Each color tale in The Secret Lives of Color, complete with its own color tab, runs just 2 to 3 pages and can be read in any order, making it a very snackable read. Thanks for listening. I love the show.
That's all for our episode this week, but we have a bonus episode in your feed too. We're going to talk about the new litigation, the criminal charge that Louisiana filed against a New York doctor who prescribed abortion pills to someone in Louisiana, and the fascinating legal questions that it raises. Who would you rather hear? What person in the world would you like to hear talk about that? I would like to hear Emily Bazelon talk about that. And guess what? I'm about to do it. It's about to happen. But that's only for Slate Plus members. You get so much good stuff for your subscription, bonus episodes, discounts to live shows. You don't hit the paywall on the Slate site. I had a Slate article I needed to read this week, and it was paywalled, and I was like, oh, I better sign in and make sure I read it. And I did. So if you are a member, thank you. If you're not a member, subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. Our researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. For Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson and David Plotz, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.